For more than 20 years, one man has been in charge of Russia, Vladimir Putin. I mean, in that same time, the US has gone through 4 presidents, the UK has had 7 prime ministers, so what's his secret? How has a former KGB agent managed to hold on to power for this long? That's what we're going to dig into today, the playbook of the spy who rules a nation.
And right away, you hit this massive puzzle. I mean, we hear all about manipulated elections and state-controlled media, but despite all that, Putin has huge support back home. So how can a leader, who many would call an autocrat, be so incredibly popular, especially with young people? Okay, get this. The numbers are just mind-blowing. A staggering 84% of young Russians, we're talking 18 to 24-year-olds, have a positive view of Putin. And almost 70% of the entire country thinks he's taking Russia down the right path. You've got to understand these numbers because they're really the key to his whole rule. They just defy any simple explanation.
All right, so to really get Putin, you have to go back in time. You have to understand the Russia he walked into. The 1990s, they were a time of just absolute chaos, a political and economic vacuum that was practically begging for a strong man to come in and take charge.
You know, the 1990s in Russia, it was basically a decade of pure shock therapy. After the Soviet Union fell apart in '91, Boris Yeltsin took over, but the whole period was just defined by chaos. Think about this. Hyperinflation hit 10,000%. By 1998, the government literally couldn't pay people salaries. So it's no surprise that by the end of it all, Yeltsin's approval rating was at a rock-bottom 2%.
This switch from communism to whatever you want to call it, it was brutal. Under the old system, yeah, it was inefficient, but at least there was some kind of stability because the state owned everything. Then, all of a sudden, it was this wild, chaotic capitalism. The country's biggest assets, oil, gas, you name it, were sold for pennies on the dollar to a handful of guys with connections. This created the oligarchs, these super rich billionaires, while millions of regular people were just plunged into poverty. So by the end of the 90s, Yeltsin and his crew, they were panicked. Totally panicked. They were terrified that if they lost their grip on power, they'd end up in jail, or worse, assassinated. They needed a successor, a puppet basically, who would protect them. And their pick? This quiet, unknown guy who was running the FSB, which is what the KGB became. His name was Vladimir Putin.
But here's the thing. Nobody knew who Putin was. He was a total unknown. Not a politician, not a celebrity. He was a spy. So how does this bureaucrat, this guy from the shadows, suddenly become a national hero, like in a matter of weeks?
Well, the answer is simple, really. Putin doesn't rule like a politician. He rules like the spy he was trained to be, using a very specific playbook he learned during his 15 years in the KGB to keep an iron grip on the country. Let's break down the 4 key tactics.
And his playbook, it's pretty straightforward. It boils down to 4 key pillars, straight from his training. First, you have to control the narrative. Second, you set an example to make sure everyone's afraid. Third, you weaponize secrets, aka blackmail. And finally, you create a completely controlled reality where you are the sole source of truth.
Okay, tactic number 1 is pure KGB. It's a concept called active measures. This isn't just about spinning the news. It's about using disinformation and propaganda to actually create the events you want, to shape reality itself. And for Putin, the very first target was the free press.
See, when Putin first took over, Russia actually had independent TV stations, channels that would openly criticize him. So one by one, he took them apart. Their owners were arrested or they were forced to flee the country. State-run companies just took over their channels. And if you didn't get the hint, well, dozens of prominent journalists died in, let's just say, suspicious ways. By 2010, basically 90% of all Russian media was controlled by the state.
All right, tactic number 2 is another KGB classic. It's the old principle of punish 1 to teach 100. The idea is you don't have to go after everybody. You just pick one powerful person and you make a terrifying, very public example out of them. That's enough to keep everyone else in line.
And Putin had the perfect target, Mikhail Khodorkovsky. At the time, he was the richest man in all of Russia. But then he made a big mistake. He publicly criticized Putin and started funding opposition parties. Next thing you know, he's arrested on his private jet, hit with tax fraud charges, and thrown in jail for 9 years. The message to every other oligarch was loud and clear. Get in line, or this will happen to you. And this pattern is still going on, with all these powerful people mysteriously falling out of windows.
Now, tactic number 3. This one might be the most sinister of all. It's called compromat. That's Russian for compromising material.
This is the dark art of psychological warfare, collecting every secret, every embarrassing photo, every dirty deal on a person, not to bring them to justice, but to use it as blackmail.
And make no mistake, this isn't just some random blackmail operation. It's institutional. The FSB supposedly has a secret division that does nothing but keep files on millions of influential people. Politicians, business leaders, journalists, you name it. It's basically a weaponized archive of everyone's worst secrets, ready to be leaked the second they step out of line.
And that brings us to the fourth and final tactic, the one that kind of pulls it all together, creating a controlled reality. Once you control all the information, you can control reality itself. The whole point is to build a super simple, really powerful story where facts are, well, they're irrelevant. It's all about emotion. And in this story, Russia is always the hero, this great fortress defending tradition. And the West, always the villain, trying to tear it down. If you repeat that lie on every channel, every single day, eventually it becomes the truth.
Okay, so now we've seen how Putin holds on to power. But that leaves the really big question, why? Is all this just about staying in charge for the sake of it, or is there a bigger plan, a long game?
Well, Putin himself gave us a massive clue. You have to remember, for him, the collapse of the Soviet Union wasn't a moment of freedom. He called it the greatest geopolitical tragedy of the 20th century. As a KGB agent who'd spent his whole life defending that empire, watching it all fall apart was a deeply personal, defining trauma for him. So when you start connecting the dots, you see these 5 big patterns emerge, and they really seem to point towards a plan to bring that old sphere of influence back. First, he uses NATO expansion as the constant trigger. Second, he builds an economic web with his Eurasian Economic Union. Third, he's got his own military alliance, the CSTO. Fourth, he's not afraid to use direct force, like in Georgia, Crimea, and Ukraine. And fifth, he pushes this whole ideology of the Russian world, the idea that any place where Russian is spoken really belongs to a greater Russia.
So this all leads to a huge question, right? Is all this just Russia lashing out defensively because it feels cornered? Or are we actually watching the slow, deliberate execution of a blueprint to build a new empire? And this leads us to our final point, and it's a pretty provocative one. The analysis we're looking at here makes a very direct and very controversial comparison to another historical figure who also came to power during a time of national collapse and humiliation.
Now, just to be super clear, what I'm about to lay out is the argument from the source material itself. It's not our opinion, it's what the analysis says. It draws 6 parallels. 1, both men rose from the ashes of a collapsed empire, promising national restoration. 2, both weaponized a story of national humiliation. 3, both needed to create enemies, inside and out, to rally people. 4, both used the excuse of protecting their people in other countries to expand their territory. 5, both systematically crushed all real opposition. And finally, 6, both fostered a kind of messiah complex, positioning themselves as the one true savior of the nation.
But the analysis also points out one crucial difference. Putin, the master spy, seems to have learned from history. He often avoids these huge all-out wars, and instead he prefers these hybrid tactics. Disinformation, cyber attacks, you know the drill. And that really leaves us with the final question this analysis poses. Are we just watching a sad echo of history repeat itself, or are we seeing the execution of a brand new and maybe more sophisticated playbook for authoritarian rule in the 21st century?